March 2, 1969. Zhenbao Island, Ussuri River, Sino-Soviet border, 8:47 a.m. Senior Lieutenant Ivan Strelnikov peered through the morning fog at the snow-covered sandbar that, depending on the season and the river's mood, was either an island or simply a memory of one. Zhenbao Island, the Soviets called it Damansky, measured barely 0.74 square kilometers at low water. At high tide, much of it vanished beneath the Ussuri River's icy current. Yet here he stood with 32 border guards, Kalashnikovs at the ready, defending this frozen speck of disputed territory as if it were Leningrad itself. Through his binoculars, Strelnikov watched the Chinese troops moving into position on their side. More than usual. Many more. He'd patrolled this sector for 2 years, enduring the ritual confrontations, shoving matches on the ice, megaphone denunciations, the occasional thrown rock. The dance had grown more aggressive lately. But it was still just a dance. Communist brothers didn't shoot each other over a sandbar. That would be absurd. What Strelnikov couldn't know, as he stamped his feet against the -20 cold, was that Chinese senior Captain Sun Yuguo had received explicit orders that morning from Beijing. Provoke the Soviets, draw their fire, and create casualties. What neither man knew was that in 11 days, Soviet Politburo members would gather in a bunker beneath Moscow to discuss something unprecedented in human history. A nuclear first strike against another communist state. Over an island that wasn't always an island. Over 0.74 square kilometers of frozen mud that would, by summer, largely disappear beneath river water. The Cold War had produced many absurdities, but perhaps none quite captured its essential madness like the Sino-Soviet border war. The world's 2 largest communist powers, possessing thousands of nuclear weapons between them, edging toward Armageddon over an island that existed only part-time. In the spring of 1969, both Moscow and Beijing believed they understood exactly what was happening on their shared border, and both were catastrophically wrong about what the other would tolerate. Soviet Premier Leonid Brezhnev viewed the border skirmishes as a Chinese probe that could be resolved through traditional Soviet methods. Overwhelming military force followed by Chinese capitulation. They are testing our resolve, he told the Politburo in late February 1969. We will demonstrate that the Soviet Union does not retreat from provocations. Defense Minister Andrei Grechko was more blunt. A short, sharp lesson will restore order. The Chinese will remember who is the senior partner in socialism. The Soviet military establishment operated from a position of supreme confidence. They possessed approximately 10,000 nuclear weapons to China's estimated 20 to 30 primitive devices. Soviet forces along the border numbered over 370,000 troops, with modern armor and air support, facing a larger but technologically inferior Chinese army. Soviet intelligence assessed that China's nuclear program was vulnerable, its delivery systems crude, its leadership unpredictable. General Oleg Zakharov, commander of Soviet border troops, prepared his forces for what he anticipated would be a brief disciplinary action. Like dealing with hooligans, as he described it in a March 1st dispatch to Moscow. The Soviets fundamentally misread Mao Zedong's calculation. KGB analysts correctly noted that Mao had descended into the chaos of the Cultural Revolution, that he'd purged much of his military leadership, that Red Guards had besieged the Soviet embassy in Beijing. But they incorrectly concluded this internal turmoil made China weak and defensive. A regime in such disorder cannot sustain external conflict, read one KGB assessment from February 1969. They were precisely backwards. Mao saw the border confrontation not as a problem, but as a solution. By March 1969, the Cultural Revolution had spiraled beyond his control. Red Guard factions battled each other in the streets. The economy was collapsing, The army, purged of experienced commanders, struggled to maintain order. Mao needed to redirect revolutionary fervor outward, and he needed to demonstrate that China, despite its chaos, remained a revolutionary power. As he told the Politburo on February 12th, the Soviet Union has become revisionist, imperialist, social fascist. We must show the world that China is the true standard-bearer of Marxism-Leninism. More personally, Mao had come to hate the Soviets with genuine ideological passion. He'd been humiliated during his 1957 Moscow visit when Khrushchev mocked Chinese backwardness. He'd been enraged when the Soviets withdrew their technical advisors in 1960, taking blueprints with them. He'd been insulted when Moscow pursued détente with the United States rather than supporting world revolution. The Russians think they can treat China like a satellite, Mao said in a January 1969 meeting. They will learn that China bows to no one. Beijing's strategy was deliberately calculated to provoke Soviet violence while appearing victimized. Marshal Chen Yi, one of the few senior military officers who'd survived the Cultural Revolution's purges, explained the logic to regional commanders in February. We must make the Soviets fire first. We must have martyrs. Then the whole nation will unite against the Soviet revisionists, and the world will see who the true aggressors are. The Chinese leadership accepted, even welcomed, the massive power asymmetry. They had studied Korean War tactics. Draw a stronger enemy into terrain that negates technological advantages, inflict casualties, demonstrate resolve, force political calculations to override military ones. The Soviets can destroy China with nuclear weapons, Defense Minister Lin Biao told commanders. But they won't, because then they would rule over ashes and be condemned by the world. We are playing a different game than they realize. Both sides entered the confrontation convinced they understood the script. The Soviets believed this was about border enforcement and teaching lessons. The Chinese knew this was about domestic politics and international positioning. Neither understood that they were about to stumble into a crisis that would bring them to the brink of nuclear war over a sandbar that, at high tide, wasn't consistently above water. The Sino-Soviet split didn't begin over disputed islands. It began over the very soul of communism itself. But those ideological differences needed physical flashpoints, and the border provided thousands of kilometers of them. The border question dated to the unequal treaties of the 19th century, when Imperial Russia seized vast territories from a weak Qing dynasty. The 1858 Treaty of Aigun and the 1860 Treaty of Peking transferred approximately 400,000 square miles of territory to Russia, more land than France and Germany combined. Soviet leaders considered these treaties legitimate historical facts. Chinese leaders, particularly Mao, viewed them as imperialist theft that Soviet Russia had never repudiated. When Mao took power in 1949, he had little choice but to accept Soviet dominance. China was devastated by civil war, desperately poor, technologically backward. The 1950 Sino-Soviet Treaty of Friendship made China a junior partner in the communist world. Soviet advisors flooded China, thousands of them, directing everything from factory construction to military training. Moscow provided crucial support during the Korean War. In the 1950s, being an ally of the Soviet Union was China's only viable strategy. But Mao chafed under Soviet condescension from the start. Nikita Khrushchev's 1956 secret speech denouncing Stalin enraged Mao, not because he loved Stalin, but because Khrushchev hadn't consulted him first. When Mao visited Moscow in 1957 for the 40th anniversary of the October Revolution, Khrushchev lectured him about China's primitive conditions and dismissed Mao's advocacy for more aggressive opposition to the West. According to Soviet interpreter Oleg Troyanovsky, Khrushchev told Mao, "You are like a child. You don't understand modern weapons or modern economics. Leave strategy to Moscow. The relationship began fracturing in earnest in 1958 to 60. Khrushchev pursued peaceful coexistence with the West, while Mao launched the catastrophic Great Leap Forward. When China provoked the Second Taiwan Strait crisis by shelling Quemoy and Matsu in 1958, Khrushchev privately raged that Mao was trying to drag the Soviet Union into war with America. In 1959, Moscow canceled its agreement to provide China with nuclear weapons technology. In July 1960, Khrushchev abruptly withdrew all 390 Soviet advisors from China, taking their blueprints and leaving projects half-finished. By 1963, the split was public and vitriolic. The two communist giants exchanged ideological denunciations. Moscow accused Beijing of petty bourgeois nationalism and left adventurism. Beijing called the Soviets revisionists who'd abandoned true Marxism-Leninism for comfortable accommodation with imperialism. Chinese propagandists began referring to the Soviet leadership as the new czars. The border disputes emerged organically from this ideological warfare. Chinese maps began showing vast territories as historically Chinese lands seized by imperialist Russia. Soviet military planners grew alarmed by Chinese rhetoric about the unequal treaties. In 1964, Mao gave an interview to a Japanese socialist delegation in which he said, "About 100 years ago, the area east of Lake Baikal became Russian territory. We have not yet presented our account for this list." The Soviet leadership took this as a direct territorial threat. Defense Minister Marshal Rodion Malinovsky ordered a massive military buildup along the Sino-Soviet border. Soviet forces in the Far East, which numbered around 12 divisions in 1964, would grow to over 30 divisions by 1969. More than 370,000 troops, 1/4 of the entire Soviet army, facing China across disputed rivers and mountain passes. The first serious border clashes occurred in 1967-68. These weren't military operations, but confrontational encounters. Chinese and Soviet border guards facing off, shoving each other, throwing rocks, firing warning shots. The Soviets tried to intimidate through displays of force. The Chinese tried to provoke through deliberate trespassing and propaganda broadcasts. Neither side wanted war, but both were willing to test the other's resolve. Zhenbao Island became a particular irritant. The island sat closer to the Chinese bank of the Ussuri River, and under traditional international law, border rivers are divided by the Thalweg principle, the line of deepest channel. By this standard, Zhenbao should belong to China. But the 1860 treaty had placed the border along the Chinese bank, giving Russia the entire river and all islands. Soviet border troops routinely patrolled Zhenbao, considering it indisputably Soviet territory. Chinese forces began crossing the ice in winter to plant flags and conduct their own patrols. These incursions increased in frequency through 1968. Soviet guards would confront them, shove them back, file reports. The confrontations grew more violent. Fistfights on the ice, broken bones, smashed equipment. In January 1969, a Chinese officer was beaten so severely by Soviet guards that he later died. Beijing used his death as propaganda, murdered by Soviet revisionists, and began planning something more substantial. By February 1969, Mao had decided on a deliberate provocation. He wanted martyrs, casualties, evidence of Soviet aggression. He wanted to rally China's fractious Red Guard factions against an external enemy. He wanted to prove that China, despite its internal chaos, would fight for its dignity. Zhenbao Island, insignificant in every practical sense, became the stage for the most dangerous confrontation between nuclear powers in Cold War history. The Chinese ambush on March 2, 1969, was meticulously planned to look spontaneous. Senior Lieutenant Strelnikov and his 32 border guards spotted Chinese troops crossing the frozen Ussuri toward Zhenbao Island around 8:40 a.m. This was familiar. Chinese provocations had become routine. The Soviet guards moved forward to intercept, following standard procedure. Close with the intruders, demand they leave Soviet territory, use physical force if necessary. What they couldn't see was the trap. Concealed in the forest on the Chinese bank, approximately 300 troops of the Chinese People's Liberation Army waited in prepared positions with machine guns, mortars, and recoilless rifles. These weren't border guards, but regular infantry, veterans who'd received explicit orders. Wait until the Soviets are fully committed, then open fire to kill. At 9:17 a.m., when Strelnikov's detachment was fully engaged with a visible Chinese patrol in the center of the ice, the hidden Chinese forces opened fire. The first burst of machine gun fire cut down Strelnikov and 6 other Soviet guards instantly. Corporal Vladimir Rabovich, one of the few survivors, later described the moment. "We were shoving them, yelling at them to leave, doing what we'd done 50 times before. Then the world exploded. Men falling everywhere, blood on the ice, Ivan's head just gone. We had no cover, no prepared positions. We were dead men standing. The ambush was devastating. Soviet guards attempted to return fire but were completely exposed on the open ice, while Chinese troops shot from concealed positions. Within minutes, 29 Soviet border guards lay dead or dying on the frozen river. Rabovich and 2 others escaped by crawling toward the Soviet bank under covering fire from reinforcements that had heard the shooting. Moscow's reaction was immediate and furious. The initial reports arrived at KGB headquarters at 11:43 a.m. Moscow time, 3:43 p.m. at the border. Premier Brezhnev convened an emergency Politburo session that evening. KGB Chief Yuri Andropov presented reconnaissance photographs and survivor testimony. Defense Minister Grechko pounded the table. "This is not a border incident. This is a military attack on Soviet territory by regular Chinese forces. This is war." The Politburo authorized a massive retaliatory operation for March 15th. 3 battalions of Soviet troops, approximately 1,000 men, with tank support and heavy artillery, would assault Zhenbao Island and annihilate any Chinese forces found there. "We will teach them such a lesson they will never forget," Brezhnev declared. But the Chinese were waiting. The March 15th Soviet operation began at dawn with an artillery barrage, 150 mm and 130mm guns firing from the Soviet bank. Soviet troops advanced across the ice with 6 T-62 tanks, expecting minimal resistance. Instead, they encountered a full Chinese regiment that had reinforced the island overnight with anti-tank weapons, including new Red Arrow 73 missiles they'd tested for this exact scenario. The battle lasted 7 hours and was far more intense than March 2nd. Chinese forces destroyed or disabled 4 Soviet tanks, including 1 T-62 that became trapped in a shell crater and was abandoned by its crew. Soviet artillery and Grad rocket systems pounded Chinese positions, but the PLA troops held their ground, firing from trenches and bunkers they dug into the frozen earth. At 2:30 p.m., after suffering approximately 60 casualties, Soviet figures, or 800 casualties, Chinese claims, the truth remains disputed, Soviet commanders ordered a withdrawal. They'd inflicted heavy Chinese casualties. Beijing would admit to 800 wounded, but they'd failed to secure the island or demonstrate overwhelming superiority. Most humiliatingly, the Chinese captured the abandoned T-62 tank and towed it back to their territory, where they would display it as a trophy and reverse engineer its advanced technology. Senior Lieutenant Colonel Dmitry Leonov, who commanded the Soviet artillery that day, later wrote in his memoirs, "We expected to punish border guards with rocks. We encountered regular infantry with modern weapons. We expected intimidation to work like it always had. we encountered fanatics who welcomed death. Everything we thought we knew about the Chinese was wrong. The crisis escalated rapidly through March and April. Soviet forces staged a massive buildup along the entire 4,000-mile border. On March 17th, Soviet troops attacked Chinese positions at multiple points along the Xinjiang border, killing several dozen. Beijing responded with massive anti-Soviet demonstrations, hundreds of thousands marching through Chinese cities, besieging the Soviet embassy, burning Brezhnev in effigy. Inside the Kremlin, more radical voices began gaining traction. General Nikolai Ogarkov proposed limited nuclear strikes against Chinese nuclear facilities at Lop Nor and missile sites near Jiuquan. China's nuclear program is still vulnerable, he argued to the Politburo. In 5 years, they may have hundreds of weapons. Now, they have perhaps 24 primitive devices. We can eliminate this threat before it matures. On March 13th, between the two Zhenbao clashes, the Soviet ambassador to the United States approached the State Department with an extraordinary question. How would Washington react if the Soviet Union launched surgical strikes against Chinese nuclear installations? This wasn't idle inquiry. The Soviets were seriously contemplating nuclear war against China and wanted to gauge American intentions. The proposal gained alarming momentum. Marshal Matvei Zakharov, chief of the General Staff, presented detailed plans for strikes using medium-range SS-4 and SS-5 missiles carrying nuclear warheads. The targets would be China's nuclear weapons facilities, research centers, and known missile sites. Zakharov estimated casualties at 1 to 2 million, but argued this was preferable to allowing China to develop a full nuclear arsenal that could eventually threaten Soviet cities. What stopped the nuclear option wasn't morality, it was calculation. KGB intelligence indicated that China had dispersed some nuclear weapons to unknown locations. A Soviet first strike might eliminate most of Chinese nuclear capability, but probably not all. If even 2 or 3 Chinese weapons survived and were delivered against Soviet cities, Vladivostok, Irkutsk, Novosibirsk, the casualties could number in the hundreds of thousands. And then there was the political calculation. The Soviet Union would be globally condemned for nuclear aggression against a fellow communist state. The United States might even align with China against Moscow. But the debate was real. Documents declassified in the 1990s reveal that nuclear strikes against China were seriously considered at the highest levels of Soviet leadership for several weeks in March-April 1969. An island that disappeared at high tide had brought the world's largest communist powers to the brink of nuclear war. The Zhenbao crisis forced both superpowers to fundamentally reassess their strategic positions, triggering adaptations that would reshape Cold War dynamics for the next 2 decades. Soviet strategic evolution. Moscow emerged from the March clashes with its confidence shaken. The vaunted Soviet military had failed to intimidate China, failed to secure a tiny island, and lost modern equipment to a supposedly backward enemy. Premier Brezhnev ordered a comprehensive review of border security and Far East military capabilities. The immediate response was massive militarization. By the end of 1969, Soviet forces along the Sino-Soviet border numbered over 370,000 troops, organized into 30 divisions. By 1973, this would grow to 44 divisions, approximately 1 million troops, making the Sino-Soviet border the world's largest militarized frontier. The Soviets deployed SS-20 intermediate-range missiles targeting Chinese cities, positioned Tu-16 and Tu-22 bombers within striking distance of Beijing, and constructed elaborate underground command bunkers in Siberia. But quantity wasn't enough. Soviet planners realized that the vast distances of Siberia and the Far East made logistics nightmares. The Trans-Siberian Railway became a strategic vulnerability, a single line supplying forces along 4,000 miles of border. Defense Minister Grechko initiated construction of the Baikal-Amur Main Line, BAM, a second Trans-Siberian railway 500 miles north of the original, specifically to support military operations against China. The BAM project would cost tens of billions of rubles and take 15 years to complete, becoming one of the Soviet Union's largest infrastructure projects. The nuclear question haunted Soviet strategists throughout 1969-70. GRU intelligence reported that China was accelerating its nuclear weapons program, successfully testing a 3-megaton hydrogen bomb in September 1969 and a medium-range ballistic missile capable of reaching Soviet Central Asia in January 1970. Soviet military planners developed increasingly elaborate scenarios for nuclear strikes against Chinese facilities. But each war game revealed the same problem. China was too large to fully disarm, retaliation was probable, and political costs were immense. By 1971, Soviet strategy shifted from considering preemptive nuclear war to building overwhelming conventional superiority combined with extended deterrence. Marshal Grechko summarized the new doctrine. We will make clear that any Chinese aggression anywhere on the border will trigger massive conventional retaliation that could include strikes deep into Chinese territory. Nuclear weapons remain available, but the cost of using them must appear too high to the Chinese. Chinese strategic adaptation. Beijing interpreted the Zhenbao clashes as a tremendous propaganda victory, regardless of casualties. Mao had successfully diverted attention from the Cultural Revolution's chaos, demonstrated China's willingness to fight a superpower, and gained international sympathy as the victim of Soviet aggression. But Chinese leaders weren't delusional about military realities. Intelligence reports revealed the scale of Soviet military buildup along the border. Hundreds of thousands of troops, thousands of tanks, hundreds of aircraft. Soviet nuclear capabilities were overwhelming. China's crude nuclear arsenal of approximately 20 to 30 weapons in 1969, deliverable only by vulnerable bombers or short-range missiles, couldn't deter a Soviet first strike. Chinese strategy evolved toward two parallel paths: military self-sufficiency and strategic realignment. Militarily, China accelerated nuclear weapons development despite economic chaos. Premier Zhou Enlai personally oversaw nuclear programs, ensuring they received resources even as other sectors collapsed. China successfully tested its first satellite in April 1970, demonstrating ICBM-relevant technology, deployed DF-4 intermediate-range missiles capable of reaching Moscow by 1972, and expanded plutonium production. By 1980, China would possess approximately 200 nuclear warheads, still dwarfed by Soviet arsenals, but large enough to impose unacceptable costs on any Soviet attack. The captured T-62 tank became a focal point for technological reverse engineering. Chinese engineers dismantled it completely, studying its 115mm smoothbore gun, composite armor, and fire control systems. While China couldn't immediately match Soviet tank technology, the T-62 analysis accelerated Chinese armor development by an estimated 5 to 7 years. Doctrinally, the PLA emphasized people's war concepts adapted for nuclear-age defense against Soviet invasion. Chinese strategists assumed Soviet forces could penetrate deep into Chinese territory, but would become overstretched and vulnerable in China's vast interior. The strategy wasn't to defeat Soviet forces in battle, but to make occupying China impossibly costly. A nuclear-age guerrilla war that would drain Soviet resources and international legitimacy. The American opportunity. The Sino-Soviet split created the Cold War's most important strategic opening for American policy. National Security Advisor Henry Kissinger and President Richard Nixon quickly grasped the implications. The communist monolith had fractured, and America could exploit the division. Beginning in 1969, the Nixon administration sent subtle signals to Beijing indicating American neutrality in the Sino-Soviet dispute. When the Soviets probed American reactions to strikes against China, the State Department's cool response made clear that Washington viewed an independent China as strategically valuable. The United States wouldn't support Soviet aggression against China and might even oppose it. Through Pakistani intermediaries, Kissinger and Zhou Enlai began secret communications in late 1969. Zhou was explicit about Chinese calculations. The Soviet revisionists have become the primary threat to China. We must consider all options to constrain them. The opening culminated in Kissinger's secret Beijing visit in July 1971 and Nixon's dramatic trip in February 1972, transforming the Cold War's basic geometry from two-power competition to three-power triangle. The strategic logic was elegant. American-Chinese rapprochement forced Moscow to consider a two-front threat. Soviet forces tied down along the Chinese border were unavailable for operations against NATO. Chinese resistance to Soviet expansion in Asia complemented American containment in Europe. Neither Washington nor Beijing sought formal alliance, but coordinated opposition to Soviet power served both nations' interests. Regional ripple effects. The Sino-Soviet split transformed Asian geopolitics. North Vietnam, previously balancing Soviet and Chinese patronage, tilted decisively toward Moscow by 1972, eventually signing a mutual defense treaty with the Soviet Union in 1978. Mongolia, wedged between the two communist giants, became one of the world's most militarized states per capita, hosting Soviet forces as a buffer against China. In Indochina, the split had deadly consequences. China's deepening hostility towards Soviet-aligned Vietnam led to Chinese support for the Khmer Rouge in Cambodia, contributing to the genocide that killed approximately 2 million people. When Vietnam invaded Cambodia in 1978 to overthrow the Khmer Rouge, China responded with the Sino-Vietnamese War in February 1979, a punitive expedition that cost tens of thousands of lives and further militarized the region. The non-aligned movement fractured over the split. Previously, developing nations could play Moscow against Beijing for aid and support. After 1969, they had to choose, or more cleverly, learn to play three great powers against each other instead of two. The closest moment to nuclear war came not during the March battles, but in August 1969, in a bunker beneath Moscow's Kremlin. Soviet Politburo members gathered on August 20th to review updated plans for strikes against Chinese nuclear facilities. KGB Chairman Yuri Andropov presented fresh intelligence. China had successfully tested a new missile with sufficient range to reach European Russia. Defense Minister Grechko showed reconnaissance photographs of construction at Lop Nor, suggesting China was preparing another nuclear test, possibly of an improved warhead design. General Ogarkov presented three military options. Option 1, diplomatic pressure and continued conventional buildup. Option 2, massive conventional strikes against Chinese nuclear facilities using tactical nuclear weapons to ensure destruction of hardened targets. Option 3, full preemptive strategic nuclear war against Chinese military and industrial centers, accepting casualties of 3 to 5 million Chinese. The debate lasted 7 hours. Transcript excerpts declassified in 1992 reveal how close the Soviets came to choosing nuclear war. Grechko: China will have 100 weapons within 5 years, 500 within 10. The window to act is closing. Prime Minister Alexei Kosygin: and the cost? Not just the Chinese dead, but our position in the world? We would be pariahs. Andropov: better pariahs than victims. Chinese nuclear weapons in sufficient numbers make Soviet Far East cities hostages. Brezhnev: what if they survive our strike with enough weapons to retaliate? What if Moscow burns? The crucial factor was uncertainty. Soviet intelligence couldn't locate all Chinese nuclear weapons. Recent dispersal programs meant some warheads were probably mobile or hidden. A Soviet first strike might eliminate 80% or even 90% of Chinese capabilities. But the remaining 10 to 20% could still devastate Soviet cities. With 20 to 30 Chinese weapons estimated to exist, that meant 2 to 6 weapons might survive. Each weapon detonated over a Soviet city would kill hundreds of thousands. The Politburo voted against nuclear preemption by a narrow margin. Instead, they chose massive conventional militarization combined with political warfare. But the vote wasn't unanimous. Several Politburo members advocated for strikes, and Brezhnev himself remained ambivalent, commenting, "Perhaps we are allowing fear to overcome strategic sense. But fear of nuclear war is not irrational. It may be the only rational position." The peak of military tension came in September 1969. Soviet and Chinese forces clashed repeatedly along the Xinjiang border, with several engagements involving battalion-strength units and resulting in hundreds of casualties. Soviet bombers flew provocative missions along the border, sometimes penetrating Chinese airspace. Chinese air defenses shot down at least 2 Soviet aircraft in September-October. On September 11th, Soviet Premier Kosygin, returning from Ho Chi Minh's funeral in Hanoi, made an unscheduled stop in Beijing to meet Zhou Enlai. The meeting, held at Beijing Airport to avoid the symbolism of Kosygin entering the Chinese capital formally, lasted 3 hours. Kosygin delivered Moscow's message bluntly. "Further provocations will trigger responses you cannot survive. We are prepared to use any means necessary to defend Soviet territory." Zhou's response was equally direct. "China will not be intimidated. We have survived Japanese invasion, American threats, nuclear blackmail. We will survive Soviet aggression. But if the Soviet Union chooses war, it will inherit ashes. Your troops will drown in an ocean of Chinese people. Your cities are as vulnerable as ours." The confrontation was existential for both sides. Soviet strategic calculations revealed unacceptable costs for invasion. Conquering and occupying even portions of China would require millions of troops facing potentially tens of millions of Chinese defenders. Nuclear strikes would kill millions, but wouldn't defeat China's ability to resist, and might trigger limited Chinese nuclear retaliation against Soviet cities. Chinese calculations were equally grim. Soviet nuclear superiority was overwhelming. Soviet conventional forces could capture substantial Chinese territory. But China's vast population, territorial depth, and leadership's demonstrated willingness to accept horrific casualties made Soviet victory meaningless. As Mao told the Politburo in October 1969, "They can destroy China. They cannot conquer China. There is a difference." The crisis gradually de-escalated through late 1969 and early 1970. Both sides pulled back from the most provocative border positions. Diplomatic channels reopened. In October 1969, China and the Soviet Union began border negotiations that would continue intermittently for the next 20 years. But the fundamental breach was irreparable. By 1970, the Sino-Soviet alliance was dead. The communist world had definitively split. The Soviet Union faced a hostile China along 4,000 miles of border, requiring permanent deployment of 1/4 of its entire military, far from European frontiers. China faced existential Soviet nuclear threat, forcing strategic reorientation toward the United States. The cost of Zhenbao Island and the border war was immense. Conservative estimates suggest 100–200 Soviet casualties and 800 to 1,000 Chinese casualties from the March clashes and subsequent border incidents through 1969. But the broader costs dwarf these figures. Tens of billions of rubles and yuan spent militarizing the border, Millions of troops diverted from other potential deployments, decades of hostility between the world's two largest communist powers. And it was almost worse. For several weeks in 1969, the world's two largest communist states seriously considered nuclear war over disputed sandbanks, freezing rivers, and historical grievances. An island that sometimes disappeared at high tide nearly triggered an exchange that could have killed millions. The Sino-Soviet border war's ultimate legacy was paradoxical. It prevented the Cold War from becoming World War III, while simultaneously making the Cold War more dangerous by adding a third nuclear-armed player operating under different strategic logic. The split destroyed communist unity permanently. No longer could Moscow claim to lead a unified socialist bloc. By 1972, Chinese and American officials were coordinating strategy against Soviet expansion, a development unthinkable a decade earlier. The communist monolith that had terrified Western strategists in the 1950s was revealed as fiction. This realization fundamentally altered American strategy, enabling détente with Moscow while opening to Beijing. For the Soviet Union, the border war was a strategic disaster that contributed to ultimate collapse. Maintaining massive forces along the Chinese border drained resources that might have modernized the Soviet economy or reinforced European positions. The psychological impact was profound. Soviet citizens and leaders internalized the reality that they faced hostile powers on all frontiers, increasing paranoia and militarization that accelerated economic decay. For China, the crisis accelerated strategic realignment that transformed it from isolated revolutionary state to pragmatic great power. Nixon's 1972 visit began China's integration into global economy and politics. The opening to America provided security against Soviet threat, while enabling economic reforms that would, by the 21st century, make China the world's second-largest economy. The nuclear implications remain sobering. Soviet consideration of nuclear first strikes against China in 1969 demonstrated how easily nuclear powers can slide toward preventive war when facing emerging nuclear rivals. That the Soviets ultimately stepped back from the nuclear brink wasn't due to moral constraints, but cold calculation of costs and uncertainties, a thin reed upon which to rest nuclear peace. Declassified documents from the 1990s revealed just how close the crisis came to nuclear war. Former Soviet officials who participated in August 1969 Politburo meetings confirmed that nuclear strikes against China received serious consideration, with several Politburo members advocating for preemption. The decision not to strike was narrow and contested, not an obvious choice, but a difficult judgment call. Today, Zhenbao Island, still called Damansky by Russians, remains divided under agreements reached after the Cold War ended. In 1991, the Soviet Union and China finally settled most border disputes, with Zhenbao Damansky split between them. The island that nearly triggered nuclear war is now a minor footnote in tourism brochures, occasionally visited by Cold War historians searching for scars of the 1969 battles. But the fundamental lesson endures. In an era of nuclear weapons, even absurd disputes over trivial territory can escalate to existential crises. An island that exists only part-time, that measures less than a square kilometer, that has no strategic value, that neither side truly needed. This island became the flashpoint for confrontation between nuclear powers because prestige, ideology, and fear overwhelmed rationality. Senior Lieutenant Strelnikov's frozen perceptions on that March morning, the confidence that communist brothers wouldn't really shoot each other, the inability to imagine how small provocations could escalate to nuclear consideration, captured the Cold War's essential danger. Nuclear weapons made every confrontation potentially catastrophic. Geography became irrelevant. An island that disappeared at high tide could vanish permanently beneath nuclear fire. The Cold War ended without nuclear war, partly through luck, partly through leaders stepping back from brinks they'd reached through miscalculation. Zhenbao Island stands as reminder that the margin between peace and annihilation is sometimes measured in Politburo votes, uncertain intelligence, and decisions made under pressure by leaders who, like Strelnikov on that frozen morning, thought they understood the rules. Until the shooting started.